Hello, welcome back to the Building a Strong Preservation Program webinar series presented by the Texas Main Street Program and Certified Local Government Program of the Texas Historical Commission. You are listening to Part 3, which will cover design guidelines and standards. I am Marie Oler King-Reed, one of the designers for the Main Street Program. My job is to work with the Main Street communities on any design problems they may have. This includes everything from basic preservation and repairs for individual buildings to the design review process. Today we're going to discuss design guidelines and standards and how they can be used in conjunction with your local preservation ordinance and design review process. What are design guidelines exactly? By definition, they're an agreed upon set of design objectives that reflect the historic resources in your community. They are supplementary to the ordinance and should be used as an educational tool that provides guidance to property owners, commissioners, and city staff in a clear way. They are a document that is created locally that outlines the preservation best practices and urban design principles for your community. They specify in what way building parts or features should be treated and repaired while allowing for more creativity in the details of additions and new construction. Guidelines are a basis for fair decisions in design review and should also create consistency and more predictability in the interpretation and implementation of a local preservation ordinance. Guidelines should humanize that ordinance by providing graphic examples and diagrams that illustrate a range of possible approaches, both good and bad, to make the regulations easier to understand. It's very important to know the difference between the different terms. The ordinance is the law. Whatever the ordinance says must be followed. Design review criteria are part of that law. Design guidelines are not in and of themselves mandatory like the ordinance and should not be confused with the ordinance. In most cases, guidelines are just that, helpful, interpretive, explanatory recommendations, a document that outlines the best practices for how to maintain and preserve historic resources. This document usually consists of written and graphic information in a printed booklet. Guidelines are typically qualitative and need to be evaluated by the Review Commission. Design standards are prescriptive and required. They can be definitively measured, and compliance is a very clear yes or no situation. They can appear in the same document as design guidelines and usually look the same, but enforcement is where the difference between standards and guidelines lie. So stated simply, standards are required, guidelines are not. Here is an example. In Fredericksburg, they have both design guidelines and standards. For years, Fredericksburg has had a set of guidelines just for the historic district. However, in 2015, as part of their comprehensive plan update, they built upon the existing guidelines for their district and converted some of them into standards, which properties are required to follow. These standards now apply to more than just the historic district. They include major corridors, areas near destinations, and buildings adjacent to the historic district. The city states that design guidelines are intended to provide guidance to developers on how to create character in the entry corridors. As properties redevelop over time, Fredericksburg's character will become more and more defined, helping to protect the value inherent in the beloved community. So under standards, property owners must follow certain rules, such as choosing from colors that were used traditionally in the city. The standards state that colors must coordinate facade elements in the overall composition, and bright colors must be used only as accent colors. In the document, they provide examples of this, which you can see here on the left. 3 of the images are of historic buildings that coordinate muted tones. The bottom right shows how red was incorporated into signage to complement the historic roof color, which ties the building together. They also include new construction examples. The Whataburger is not in the historic district, but is on one of the main entry corridors. It uses the limestone and light cream base colors seen throughout the town and incorporates the business's bright accent color in the awning and signage. The Secretary of the Interior standards should be the basis for all design guidelines. The standards are a series of concepts about maintaining, repairing, and replacing historic materials, as well as designing new additions or making alterations. They provide a framework and guidance for decision-making about work or changes to a historic property. The standards are broken down into 4 treatments: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. There are about 10 standards under each treatment. Rehabilitation standards are most commonly used because they allow for new uses and modern conveniences such as air conditioning while preserving the historic character of the building. If you want to learn more about these 4 treatments specifically, Visit the CLG page on the Texas Historical Commission website and watch the webinar. However, the standards should not be the only guidelines a city uses in design review. The Secretary of Interior standards are very broad. They provide general philosophical principles developed by the federal government for reviewing project works on individual buildings that are receiving federal grants or tax credits. But each local historic district is unique. It has unique buildings and sites that share a common history, appearance, and special meaning in that time and place. Any modifications in the local historic district have a direct visual impact on this uniqueness and distinctive character, and the standards do not address those issues specifically, like local design lines can. The standards also do not cover other issues that may impact your district, such as signage and new construction. Your guidelines can specifically address how those elements impact the look and feel of your district. Local design guidelines should be based on the Secretary of Interior standards, but then should build upon them to take the unique character of the district into consideration. All guideline documents should cover the basic parts of the historic buildings in your district. Look at an individual building from the front. Guidelines should cover everything you see: windows, doors, storefronts, canopies, roofs, walls, signage, etc. They should also discuss the basic form and massing of a building and how it relates to the buildings around it. This includes things like alignment with the sidewalk edge, organization of elements both horizontally and vertically, and rhythm of windows and placements of decorative features. However, guidelines can go beyond the basics to include individual materials, landscaping, lighting, sidewalks, and other site features. Additions and new construction should also be discussed because these interventions can directly impact the look and feel of your district. Some cities have also included topics such as parking and sustainability. To determine what should be included in your local design guidelines, take a look at your district first. Is the district commercial or residential? What types of design questions come up in this area? And then specifically address those topics, keeping in mind that the guideline document should be a useful tool for the people who interact with those buildings every day. Guidelines can do several things. They can expand, explain, and interpret general design criteria in your preservation ordinance. They can indicate which approaches to design a community encourages, as well as which it discourages, and then the creative possibilities that are appropriate in that area. They can serve as a tool for designers and their clients to use in making wise design decisions about the future of the property. And they can also serve as a tool for commissioners to use when reviewing proposed designs within the district. They can also identify the character-defining features of a historic area and help to protect those visual aspects. However, there are several things guidelines cannot do. Guidelines cannot serve the same legal purpose as the design review provision of the ordinance. Remember, the ordinance is the law, but guidelines are typically not laws. Guidelines cannot limit growth or regulate where growth takes place. Guidelines address only the visual impact of individual projects on the character of a local historic district. Growth itself is a separate issue that must be addressed through zoning ordinances and preservation planning. Guidelines cannot control how space within a building is used. Guidelines usually only deal with the exterior or publicly visible portions of the building, not how the interior of the building is laid out or used. Guidelines also cannot guarantee high-quality construction. A project may meet minimum design requirements, but guidelines do not discuss craftsmanship. Therefore, there is no guarantee that the final project will be quality. Guidelines and standards are for two main groups of people: the people working on the building and the people reviewing the work being done to the building. Guidelines must be a clear foundation that both groups can use to learn from and communicate to each other with. It's a common misconception that design guidelines discourage new development within a district, when in fact many developers like design guidelines in an area because neighboring properties are held to the same level of standards as their property, which guarantees some level of predictability in the overall look and feel of the area. Because guidelines should be a tool for everyone in the district, make your guidelines easily available. Have them on your website and promote their location regularly to owners in the district. The document should be downloadable, and some cities like San Antonio and Georgetown even go so far as to have each chapter broken down on their website to make the document easier to navigate. Consider holding educational events, such as workshops that explain how to use the document, and present case studies of past projects in the area that have used the guidelines. In the majority of situations, design guidelines are used in a regulated district, meaning that design review is mandated under a preservation ordinance. Property owners must participate in the review discussion and must abide by the findings of the commission. Sometimes communities use the guidelines with special incentive programs that encourage investment in the historic district. For example, many main streets offer facade grants to qualified property owners on the condition that certain design guidelines are followed. In this case, the owner voluntarily enters the program, but then compliance is required in order to receive the funds. Design review can also be an advisory process, in which property owners voluntarily use the guidelines. They may also voluntarily appear before the Historic Preservation Commission to hear their comments, but compliance with the comments are not required. The system starts the conversation and helps to inform property owners on best preservation practices. Each of these alternative uses requires personnel to administer them in various forms. Design guidelines can apply to many different types of districts, including both commercial and residential. Some cities create guidelines that apply to anything designated as historic within their entire city, while others incorporate preservation into their development standards that apply to the whole community. Some cities create a base guideline set neighborhoods can then take and add to for their specific district. It just depends on the resources in your community and how you want to use these guidelines. Guidelines can come in many different formats. Start looking at examples and you'll see that they are all similar yet different. The main point here is to make guidelines clear and concise. The goal is to help people, not confuse them. A guideline typically has 4 components. The first being a policy statement that describes a desired state or condition of the design element being discussed. In the example, the policy statement is, original architectural details should be preserved in place whenever feasible. Number 2, a guideline statement is included that describes a desired design treatment that is performance-oriented. For instance, avoid removing or altering any significant architectural details. Under the guideline statement is supplementary information that may include additional requirements or may provide an expanded explanation. In the example, the supplementary information explains that details in good condition or that could be repaired in place should not be removed. Lastly, and most importantly, illustrations are provided to clarify the intent of the guideline. Some cities use the recommended, not recommended format, as you can see here. This example is from Seguin. This format still has the typical components covered on the previous slide, but it puts more emphasis on what to do and what not to do. For instance, it is recommended that old mortar is duplicated in strength, composition, color, and texture. It is not recommended to repoint with mortar of high Portland cement content unless it is the content of the historic mortar. Plano recently updated their design guidelines, and in their update, they realized the value of images. Now, I'm a visual learner, so may be slightly biased, but in design guidelines, we are discussing visual building features and elements. For most people, it's hard to know what a transom window or pressed metal cornice is, let alone envision one and make the right decisions without a picture. So be like Plano. Include images everywhere in your document. Even if they are standards and are required, guidelines or standards should be a separate document from the ordinance that outlines what is and what is not appropriate for historic buildings. Pictures are a key part of that. In the updated document, Plano also included a picture matrix at the end of each chapter to show more good and bad examples of the standards that they were just describing. So after they discussed storefronts in the text, this page is included. The top row depicts storefronts from historic photos of Plano. The second row shows 3 appropriate storefront designs. They are described as historic restoration, which would be a reconstructing exactly what was seen in the historic photo, or a simplified interpretation which retains the historic scale and ratios of the historic storefront, or a contemporary interpretation where traditional components are conveyed, such as bulkheads, but new materials are used to construct it. The last row illustrates any appropriate storefront designs. This includes windows with a single pane, or storefronts that have vertical articulations. So instead of just writing these requirements down, Plano uses several pictures to explain the guidelines. This is very important if your document is to be a tool for building owners. When creating local guidelines, the first order of business is to put together a team to draft your local design guidelines. Will you hire a consultant, or will a local writing team create your document? Writing guidelines can be very daunting and time-consuming, so a lot of times the city will hire a consultant specifically to lead and carry out this process. If this is the direction you choose, be sure that local stakeholders are involved every step of the way. Engage knowledgeable and committed people in your guidelines work group, including local preservation groups, historical societies, district residents, policy setting officials, and code inspectors. Also consult preservation professionals who have experience with this kind of work, such as architects, preservation consultants, urban planners, and lawyers. They can provide invaluable ideas on the substance and effect of the proposed language. Hiring a consultant to lead the creation of local design guidelines is a great project for CLG grants. Remember that if your community is a CLG, there are grant funds specifically appropriated for you for these kinds of projects. If you're not a CLG but would like to find out more, contact me after this presentation or visit the THC website for more information. The second step is to analyze your district's character. It is essential to have a clear understanding of the history of the district and how that history is reflected by its physical characteristics such as architecture, landscape, and street plan. Has the district evolved over time, or does it represent one period in time? Decide exactly what needs to be protected. This may have already been done for you if your district has been surveyed as part of creating the local preservation ordinance or district designation process. If you do have a completed historic resources survey, use this as a foundation in creating local guidelines. While you're researching and writing guidelines, review other cities' guidelines. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. See how other historic districts have developed design guidelines and how they have addressed specific topics. Choose basic elements that apply to your own district and adapt them. Especially note successful methods of illustrating basic preservation concepts, as this is where all guidelines should start. Step number 4, identify historic preservation goals and district needs. Will buildings in the district be preserved as is, rehabilitated for new uses, or restored to an earlier appearance? Identify the approach or approaches to work that will protect the historical value and significant features of the district. Review the Secretary of Interior standards to refresh your memory on what each treatment type includes. Remember that the Secretary standards are broad and local guidelines should be more specific. Local guidelines must be custom tailored to the particular history and characteristics of the district. For example, if a town has 6 districts that differ in appearance and the kinds of work that need to protect them, then each one should have a specific set of guidelines. Your document should start with an illustrated history that identifies significant characteristics and features of the district, such as architectural styles or streetscape elements. The use of photos and drawings throughout to reinforce these key points is strongly recommended. Information on materials, maintenance, repair, and replacement should also be included, as well as guidance on new construction in the district. Refer to the guidelines checklist for a full list of topics that your guidelines can cover. Finally, review your design guidelines. While in the final draft, ask a number of questions. Are the guidelines consistent with the provisions of the ordinance? Do they achieve your original goals? Do they conflict with the ordinance or any other codes? Will the guidelines meet with community support? How do you want to use your guidelines? Are they truly advisory in nature, or should them standards or criteria because you want to make them requirements? Answering questions like these can prevent problems that might otherwise arise later. Now we're going to take a look at a few examples from several different cities across the state. First up is San Antonio. If you're trying to better understand guidelines or researching for your own city, start here. The guidelines are easily accessible on the city's website. San Antonio has historic design guidelines that apply to all designated properties. They also have district-specific guidelines for unique areas such as downtown. The historic design guidelines include 8 different chapters that discuss everything from exterior elements on the historic buildings to additions and new construction, site elements, and signage. They also include a chapter that explains the different styles and features found throughout San Antonio. Overall, San Antonio's guidelines are a good example of how guidelines should be used as an educational tool. Each section starts with the basic guidelines text, which you can see here on the left. On that same page, they explain why preserving that feature is so important. For instance, here they're discussing windows, and they explicitly say that windows contribute to the overall character of the building, and that historic windows are generally constructed better than contemporary replacements. So they don't just tell the public to preserve the windows, they give them a reason why. On the next page, which you can see here on the right, they provide several pictures on what to do and what not to do, further explaining the guidelines. On the third page of that section, they provide resources on where to find instructions and workshops for repairing historic windows. This is a very important step. Many guidelines say preserve your historic windows, but they stop at that. However, most people do not know the first thing about repairing wood windows or even where to start. San Antonio provides specific direction for each building element, which makes their guidelines more useful and easy to use. Guidelines like San Antonio's can be intimidating for some of the smaller towns or even some of the bigger towns that we work with. They took a lot of time and money, and that not a lot of cities have. But that doesn't mean you can't have design guidelines. Elgin's are a great example of this. Their design guidelines update was completed by the Historic Review Board and local HPO. Everything from the text to the photos to the layout was done locally. They had a preservation professional review the final document to verify that they were encouraging appropriate treatments. Elgin's guidelines aren't as elaborate as others, but they still hit the major points and cover the topics that encourage property owners to make wise decisions about their building. They discuss all building components and general maintenance for each. They also dig into the history of their district and identify features such as rolled tin awnings, seen here, that are especially unique to their town. Elgin includes historic photographs to emphasize how special these features are, and they pair them with what these awnings look like now. In their document, Elgin even includes uncommon features such as roof gardens and ghost signs, because those are particular issues they deal with on a regular basis in their downtown. Because the document was written locally, local flavor was incorporated that truly makes these guidelines fit the historic resources of the town. The next example is from Waxahachie. Their guidelines are specifically for their downtown historic commercial district. The first full chapter provides a detailed explanation of why the city has design guidelines and who uses them. They also explain the underlying policies that make the design guidelines possible. They explain zoning, sustainability, and the historical development of Waxahachie as well. And then more importantly, they break down how to use the guidelines depending on the project type and work undertaken, which you can see here in these diagrams. The local ordinance and design review process can be really confusing. These charts and diagrams help make it less so. The diagram on the left provides advice on how to plan a preservation project in general. The chart on the right specifies how each chapter applies to specific project types. This is a great introduction for the beginning of the document because it helps break down all the different pieces into bite-sized parts for the general public who may be using the document. It's very important that your guidelines cover the unique historic resources within your local district. Sometimes these properties are commercial and sometimes they're residential. In Galveston, they have one document that has standards for all historic properties. However, the chapters are broken down into general preservation, residential, commercial, and the final chapter covers the unique history and design of each local historic district. It's important that the guidelines cover both property types because although both are historic, commercial and residential properties were designed differently, with different purposes, and therefore they need to be maintained in ways that apply to those features. For instance, commercial buildings typically have flat roofs, while residences have gabled or hipped roofs. Although they are both roofs, the character-defining features and materials are usually different. Commercial areas and residential neighborhoods also developed with different street patterns and urban plans. Commercial buildings typically meet the sidewalk edge, while neighborhoods might have front yards. Galveston's guidelines covers this and provides images and diagrams to highlight the unique characters of each. In your design guidelines, you can do as Galveston did and include each property type in one document, or you can have a set of guidelines and standards for each district. Whatever way you choose, make sure that the different design elements of commercial and residential is clear and that the design guidelines cover those features. In both the commercial and residential chapters, the Galveston standards cover additions and new constructions. This includes a discussion on the shape, massing, form, and size of the building. They also explain how the new building should align and relate to the surrounding context. For instance, for houses, the standards include diagrams on where the addition should be placed and how it should attach to the existing building. This includes pointing out what not to do, such as adding a second story to a one-story house, which you can see here on the left. For commercial buildings on the right, the standards explain that a new building should incorporate design features that break down the scale of the building into smaller modules that relate to the historic pattern of development and bring a more human scale to the district. New infill and additions will come up in your district. Providing clear standards that must be followed will help ensure that growth won't negatively impact your historic resources. Before creating design guidelines, Killeen undertook a historic resources survey where they identified that their downtown is essentially split into two general styles: pre-war, some may call this Victorian, and mid-century. Each style has very distinctive and different character-defining features, but both are equally as important to the district as a whole and historic in their own right. Because of this, Killeen had to consider the various types of work that were appropriate for each style. They start out by saying preservation of historic fabric is the most important factor in either situation. They also state that a pedestrian-friendly district is important throughout the entire downtown. For individual building rehabs, they state how the styles are the same and then list what is appropriate when they differ. For instance, under the door, window, and storefront section, the guidelines state both pre-war and mid-century buildings in downtown Killeen exhibit the typical features of a commercial storefront: large display windows at the ground level with smaller windows above for multi-story buildings, or a high parapet with no windows above for a single-story building. Because of this, they recommend that for both styles, original openings are maintained as well as the size and shape of the doors and windows. However, the two styles vary greatly when it comes to signage. In the guidelines, instead of limiting signage size by square footage or percentage of the whole facade, the guidelines simply state that the scale and placement of the sign should fit within the architectural details. Therefore, large signs that were typical of mid-century buildings can be approved on a mid-century building, while a smaller, more appropriate sign can be approved for a pre-war building. Many guidelines just talk about the building features such as windows, doors, roofs, and storefronts. However, Paris's design standards go beyond the features to discuss the materials that make up those features. This includes brick, stone, wood, metal, glass, and stucco. For each material, they explain how the material is used. For example, many commercial buildings in Paris are constructed of brick masonry. Then they explain how to clean those buildings and how to repair the material. For instance, sandblasting is prohibited, while water washing is the gentlest means possible. Maintenance is key to preserve any historic building. Paris's guidelines acknowledge that and make sure that the owners understand how to care for their property. Amarillo has urban design standards that apply to their entire downtown. Because of this, they include standards that apply to walkways and sidewalks. Each sidewalk element is specified so that the entire district coordinates. They also discuss the importance of nice sidewalks and how to properly lay out zones so that there is plenty of walking space and space for other amenities. Amarillo understands that well-designed walkways create a safe and comfortable environment for pedestrians. They support this ideal through their design standards, which creates an active, linear public space for people to walk, shop, and socialize. This webinar is just the first step in understanding, creating, and using design guidelines and standards. The best way to understand them is to start looking at other cities' guidelines yourself. In addition to this webinar, I've included two handouts. One has links to several example guidelines that we discussed from other Texas cities, as well as a few other articles and resources that discuss how to create your own guidelines. In the other handout, there's a checklist similar to the one seen on the slide that suggests topics that should be included in every document. Thank you so much for watching this webinar on design guidelines and standards. Be sure to watch the rest of the Building a Strong Preservation Program webinar series available on the THC website. Please feel free to contact myself or the CLG staff with any questions you may have. We're here to help.